Okay, so we've had a lot of discussion of guidelines, merger guidelines already today. So we've had an amuse-bouche with the EVP first thing. We've had the starter with Fiona, Guillaume, and Joel. I like to think that we're coming on to the main course of our discussion of the guidelines, which is this panel, all points of the compass, what next for merger control under the new guidelines. So the current merger guidelines were published in 2004, and I think it's fair to say the world has changed a bit since then. So Facebook was launched the day before the current guidelines came into effect. The iPhone was launched around 3 years later. General Electric was the world's biggest company by market capitalization at the time of the last round of the guidelines, and China's share of global GDP was about 10 to 15 percentage points lower than it is today. So against that backdrop, I think it's fitting that the Commission has used a compass as the metaphor for its review of the guidelines, because merger control has got some difficult waters to navigate. It's potentially being pulled in different directions. We've heard this morning about the interplay between competition and trade, competitiveness, resilience, sustainability. There's also more kind of prosaic questions about how to incorporate new theories of harm, new analyses, new techniques that result from new technology and developments in the case law. So a lot to go on, a lot to feed into this refresh. And in light of this, I'd like to use this panel to kind of dive into the specifics and try and build out a picture of what merger control is going to look like over the next 20 years. And I couldn't ask for a better group of people to do that with. So to introduce our panel, we have Daniele Calisti, who is a head of unit at DG Comp and is leading the charge on the review of the guidelines. Elisabetta Iossa is commissioner at the Italian Competition Authority and also a distinguished academic economist focusing on competition policy and industrial economics. Damien Gerard is the head of the Belgian Competition Authority, which is working on multiple cases impacted by the review of, close enough. And Ted Rosenbaum is the acting director of the Bureau of Economics at the US Federal Trade Commission and has recent practical experience of implementing the new merger guidelines. And finally, Fernando Castillo de la Torre is the principal legal advisor for competition and mergers at the Commission, a man with a strong stake in ensuring that these guidelines provide a framework that will stand up in front of the courts. So I thought it would be useful we start with a bit of an introduction as to what we might see from the guidelines. So Daniele, you're at the forefront of this. As I mentioned, could you kind of lay out for us some of the key areas of innovation that we can look forward to, what we might expect to see?
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me here today. I think this morning we heard more eloquently from the Executive Vice President and from Guillaume just now about what are the main key topics. So I don't want to be too repetitive, and I think I've adjusted a bit what I was planning to say to focus a bit on some of the aspects that maybe we have not yet discussed today. I think if I can summarize what you have heard since this morning is, the main topic is what Rafael said before, breakneck speed, probably. I've also learned that you count in CRA years policy developments, and I think that if you think back where we were 1 year ago and where we plan to be a year from now, you see how fast this project is going. Which makes the second point that you've heard this morning, particularly from the EVP, is the transparency of the process, which we value a lot. Guillaume mentioned before the workshop that we had last week, and it was just the first of a number of workshops and stakeholder interactions, because this is really crucial for us to translate all of this into something concrete. And the last is a bit the relevance of the work that we are doing for a number of policy strands. And you recall that our public consultation was structured around the compass with a lot of the topics, but I would also call them the Brussels buzzwords that may have been relevant for the review. I think that the idea is now to transform them into something more concrete. I cannot speak about all of them, so I picked 4, which unfortunately are also the ones that have been picked by people who spoke before me, but that also tells you a little bit how, the topics that are relevant are and that have captured the public debate. So those that are important to address probably are those. I will go through them briefly. The first is scale. It was there in the mission letter to Executive Vice President Ribera. You've seen it in the competitiveness compass, which, by the way, has copyright on the compass concept that we then transformed a bit for the guidelines. And if I can summarize some of the views that came from some of the companies that responded to the public consultation is you need to understand that in today's economy, you need scale to be competitive. So merger control, which is against scale, so the argument goes, should adapt to be more lenient and to enable scale to happen on a more systematic basis. And that, hence the discussion, are you going to be more linear or less lenient and so on and so forth. I think first that in the public consultation as broad as the one we have had, where we had around 250 responses, which if you count companies that responded to the different consultations, brings us down to a still high number of 200 respondents, which is unprecedented also in terms of range of stakeholders in a public consultation on mergers specifically. The advantage of that is that you find a wide garden variety of views. So, obviously it's difficult to then, try to bring them all together along a single theme. On scale, obviously, what you find also in the public consultation is that, some SMEs, I'm thinking of one group in particular, you can look it up on the public responses that says, well, yes, you're talking about a lot of interesting concepts about the importance to be big, the importance to be innovative, but for us, the most important thing is that our suppliers do not increase prices for us because then we become non-competitive. And also some consumer associations that remind you how, behind the debate on scale, there is sometimes an issue because, there can be companies that want to become bigger to then exercise market power that gives them a bit of a rent position in certain markets. And I think that the way to reconcile all of this is, it's been already said before, it's, the distinction between scale and market power. The merger regulation is neutral about scale. On the contrary, it tries to identify what then in the guidelines we clarified as market power, as what is dangerous when companies become bigger. But there is no bias against scale embedded in the merger regulation. I think there's no big is bad. There's no efficiency offense out there. And so you don't have to expect to see that going forward as well. But I think one important element which, if we look forward, has already been underlined by the Executive Vice President in the Lisbon conference, if I remember correctly, was that she said, well, we have rules that explain when a merger is bad, but I think in the new guidelines we will also try to explain some of the circumstances, so we will give some positive guidance on scale to say when certain transactions can be positive and beneficial to the single market. So that's, I think, one sense of travel that we need to watch out for. Related to that, there's the issue of resilience, another concept that has been already discussed this morning. I think there, when you read all the platform of responses, all the set of responses to the market, to the public consultation, it becomes a bit of a question of semantics. Everybody tries to now frame their submission under an angle of resilience. It's difficult to find a single defining concept that captures what, people expect from resilience. But if I can then try to summarize two broad understandings that come from the public consultation, you have resilience as you need to be big to resist to shocks, and resilience as you need to have a diverse economy, to have some companies that will resist to shocks, and then they can prosper in that economy. And I think that this binary approach coming from an enforcement past professionally, I think it's not surprising because it's not just that different companies hold different views. Sometimes the same companies hold different views about what resilience of their own supply chain is, because if in a market investigation you ask a company, is there enough competition at in your market? They say, well, there's too much competition, we struggle a lot. And then you ask them, and what about your suppliers? They say, well, that's too little competition, we struggle a lot. Now, when you have to draft guidelines, how do you reconcile these views, these different views among different European companies about what type of resilience is necessary for Europe? I think, and that's the beauty of having a transparent discussion, in the workshop last week, there was a very interesting intervention, which I will not quote because, I don't want to, but that's also the benefit of having a discussion to understand ideas, is that you don't have to take the perspective of when you draft guidelines that apply to all sectors, you don't have to take the perspective of one supply chain, of one company, etc. You have to take the perspective of the single market, probably, to think what are the key parameters to understand if really a deal can advance resilience and how can we draft them in a way that can be applied sometimes, obviously in a restrictive manner, to preserve competition, to preserve resilience, and sometimes otherwise. The third I wanted to mention is on the metrics. There was one of the papers of consultation was about the metrics for market power that we use in merger control. It was one of the topics of the workshop last week, and here I think that a bit of a surreal feeling is when you have lawyers and economists sometimes discuss is that, you know, whenever you start discussing metrics, people think, well, you're going to want to have presumptions that, right? You want to have like your market shares that are very static and, you know, and that you want to then dispose of cases with. There are two things to say there, and it's a view that has been expressed in the public consultation and also in the workshop. I think I wanted to give a word of reassurance there. One is that if you think of how we use metric in okay, we use this metric and then case done, this is normally done in simplification cases. So the biggest example of the EC applying certain metrics in a way that allows it as an institution to dispose of cases is when it clears. And in 90% of cases after simplification, we clear on the basis of metrics, which sometimes are market share metrics, sometimes they're turnover metrics, and I think that nobody disputes that these are useful. Then, of course, there are cases where we find issues. So how do metrics play in those cases? Well, the last case where we had a prohibition where I've worked on when I was doing cases, I mean, we had in excess of 600 pages in a case where we had a merger to above 60%, in some markets above 70%. So describing the Commission as the type of institution that says, oh, high market shares, I'm done, or that wants to do that type of work is not the case. But I think it's useful to have a discussion about what metrics, even beyond market shares, are useful when you want to describe market power. Because if eventually guidelines, I mean, cases are complicated, but guidelines need to be simple. Not in the sense that you do not look at the evidence or you will not try to capture effects, but if in guidelines you say it's complicated, I can do a range of different things, you're not really guiding companies about how you will look at markets. So that's a reflection that we also need to have. And the last is innovation. I think there I would not want to talk too much because I think it was the main topic of the Executive Vice President's speech this morning, and I just want to repeat a bit what you can expect to see in the new guidelines as she announced it this morning. I think that there's the idea, we could call it dynamic counterfactual, that we will try to lengthen our time horizon to try to understand when there is robust evidence, what can be market developments that we need to take into account when looking at mergers, codifying theories of harm that are more dynamic, but also look at dynamic efficiencies and provide a solid framework, including what type of evidence is necessary to prove these dynamic efficiencies. Last not least, when you try to describe this and you go into a territory where you're not very much held by your typical metrics, as I was meaning them before, I think that one of the criticisms that came in the public consultation is that you should be careful that when you try to do something new, which is this dynamic approach, which is not entirely new, but has novel aspects, you need to be careful not to undo the good things that you're doing already, because as I was saying before, static criteria sometimes are useful to dispose of a case in more than 90% of cases, if we want to be honest about it. But also when it comes to dynamic assessment, when you have market, when you have to look at more dynamic aspects, there as well you need to give some easy criteria to apply. And that's why the Vice President announced that we're going to have an innovation shield, which, as Guillaume mentioned, is a safe harbor, which is a bit the equivalent in dynamic terms of our safe harbors in static terms, to give comfort to market operators of when transactions that happen in innovative spaces will not necessarily trigger the attention of regulators.
Cool. So I wanted to maybe unpack, because you've got a few areas then where you're having to do something new. Things like innovation efficiencies, dynamic efficiencies, scale efficiencies are very, very thin, if not entirely absent in the current guidelines. And you've then got a question of how much are you sort of having to kind of sketch out the mechanisms and how much you're going to sort of specify, what sort of evidence is going to be compelling. And I guess the challenge with doing the latter is that's a pretty kind of case-specific question, and some of these innovations and efficiencies in future cases are quite hard to predict. So I was wondering, given your point that guidelines have to be simple, cases are complicated, do you have a sense of how you're going to strike that balance between kind of providing specificity but not kind of being overly specific, if you see what I mean?
That's the difficult part of the job, I think. Even dynamic things that happen are based on incentives or structures of markets or things that you can observe today. And that's where we need to be careful, because also, I have the head of the competition team at the legal service to my right, and the court is very strict when it comes to what you can figure about what happens in the future. I think what the court said when we wanted to have theories of harm about more dynamic things is, but what can you look into today and what chains of causation you can prove and how will then they produce effects tomorrow? So the answer is, I think, you can always look at things today and see if you have enough evidence of what's there today that gives you enough comfort that you can have a forecast that is of what's likely to happen tomorrow. And that's where we have to strike the balance, also with examples of what type of evidence, because that's also something that has come in when we talk about efficiencies in the public consultation, is that companies say, it's never clear what type of evidence you will consider particularly probative in given cases. So I think giving a bit of a taxonomy of what things can help could be something that may help in that respect.
Okay. Cool. So I want to sort of pick up one of the themes you had, which we've also touched on earlier in the day, which was dynamic theories and innovation. And I was thinking, Elisabetta, that could be a place where you can come at this with both a sort of academic and regulator hat on. So how do you see the debate on dynamic effects in mergers? What have we learned from recent cases? And are there sort of any lessons that you would want reflected in these guidelines?
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everybody. So I'd like to make 7 points. So you're ready. And as always, because I have an academic hat on top of the enforcer's hat, I like to take the big picture first. I think that's very helpful. And the big picture is one where we've seen in Europe, especially in the Draghi report, that there was this productivity gap in some sectors, not everywhere, and that this could be due to lack of innovation, as innovation is the lever for an increase in productivity. And the Nobel Prizes in economics this year were precisely on how innovation is crucial to achieve growth through these creative distractions where new firms come in and replace perhaps existing ones or existing products, existing services, existing processes. Now, in this framework, we have always to start from acknowledging that competition does not stand in the way of more innovation and therefore growth. This is why it's part, and it's mentioned in Article 3 of the treaty, which tells that competition is a tool to a greater end, the open social market economy Commissioner Vibera referred to. And I think it was also very interesting that we've seen a number of academic papers on top of the Commission's also paper showing precisely how competition helps to increase export success, to increase benefit formation, and to benefit consumers overall. I'd also like to share, and this is my point too, that whenever we think of an objective, really we need to first of all think what is the best tool to achieve that objective. And the Draghi report is not just about merger policy, it's really about all these other tools. And in terms of innovation, economists will know very well that you have to try to use a combination of supply side and demand side tools. And these include, for example, R&D subsidies, tax credits. You have to invest in education and research. You have to invest in the competence of the public sector because they give money, research grants, or, for example, they manage procurement of innovation, which is back this year, also mentioned in the Draghi report. And on top of everything, you have to allow easy access to credit. So these are the tools economists have identified as the fundamental tools to sort of promote innovation. Now, back to us, third point. there is no evidence of over-enforcement in merger policy. I think, in fact, a year ago we were here talking about the increasing concentration in the US to a much more limited extent in EU, and therefore there was a lot of research in economics. I mentioned, for example, Duso paper and co-authors showing that, if anything, perhaps there's been sometimes a too lenient merger enforcement. And there is no evidence saying that merger stood in the way of innovation. In fact, as an enforcer, now with my enforcer's hat, I looked at the enforcement history in the Autorità Garante della Concorrenza del Mercato, and noticed that out of 70 to 100 notifications that we receive every year, less than 5 reach phase 2, and only 5% are blocked. So 90% are cleared with remedies. So the other thing, point 4, I'd like to make is that our experience shows that there is really nothing that stands in the way of taking into account non-price effects. In Europe, we never had a focus on price and quantities. It was always a very flexible approach that would allow us also to take into account quality, to take into account innovation, to take into account privacy, sustainability, and other issues, precisely because a flexible set of principles allow us to adjust as market evolves and consumer preferences evolve, and that, of course, for example, affects willingness to pay, market definition, and on top of possible dynamic effects. And in fact, in the Italian Antitrust Authority, we have considered mergers which involved, for example, a target that was a very innovative innovator. We have even identified markets around that very innovative innovator. A case in point involved Luxottica and Barberini, and we designed and we accepted, made binding remedies where we will make sure that that innovator will maintain contracts with acquirers firm. So on top of this, if you think about all the mergers we have to analyze or the agreements we have analyzed in the telecom sector, dynamic effects have always been there, and we've had to analyze them with regard to also investment and incentives. The Italian authority, on top of this, in December 2022, received the power to also review mergers below the two compulsory the two thresholds for compulsory notification. Our parliament at that time was very long-sighted, understood that we need to focus more on innovation, and identified a problem with the acquisition of nascent competitors. So we now have an experience that dates back to 2023, since we apply them. We have consulted the market to identify very clear guidelines, because of course this power was given to us, especially because of what we were seeing with regard to the acquisitions of small and innovative firms that would raise a concern. But in fact, it turned out to be useful also in more traditional markets. But when you talk about innovation, you have to identify, guidance to make the business sector perceive that there is not undue uncertainty. Of course, some uncertainty remains, and that's why in our guidelines we've been as precise as possible, while at the same time acknowledging that as we're talking about also dynamic effects, you have to retain element of flexibility there. So we have, for example, 3 conditions for us to call in these mergers. One is a substantial condition on the turnover thresholds. One is a local nexus condition that says that the merger has to have an impact on the national market, even a potential impact. And a third one, which is a time dimension that says we cannot call in a merger if more than 6 months have elapsed. These guidelines are continuously being reflected upon. They seem to be working because we have not been submerged by requests for clarification or by letters which firms can submit asking us whether we're going to view a potential merger as problematic. So we are responding, and I think the system is working quite well thanks to these guidelines. Now, with all this in mind, back to the debate, which is my last point. Again, I think it's important to go back to what the theory says about innovation, because if there are more guidelines that we can sort of receive, that's good, but it's not going to be such an easy task, as there are a lot of conflicting effects when you think about the impact of competition and the merger on innovation. And we need, I think, to retain that flexibility to be able to really identify the conditions in which a merger takes place on a case-by-case basis and using really concrete evidence, facts. And I'm very pleased to hear what BP Teresa Ribera said, the chief economist Emanuele Tarantino said, and Daniele Calisti. So I think we're all aligned on this technical, not political exercise, because that's what business also asks in terms of predictability and certainty. Now, if you go back to the economics, I think it's also interesting to see the debate, which is quite of a fierce debate in the academia about the impact of mergers on innovation. And there have been a number of recent papers that try to put clarity here. So let me just very briefly touch upon two things. So very first, absent synergies, you have two effects. The demand expansion effect that says that because price-cost margins go up, there may be a greater incentive for the merger entity to innovate. And the second effect, instead, is a market power effect that says that because the production level goes down due to market power, there is less incentives to innovate in order to enhance productivity, reducing costs. Now, economic theory has also shown that in general circumstances on the demand curve and supply curve, so in most cases, the negative effect prevails on the positive effect. That says that a merger will be leading to a reduction in innovation, absent synergies. I mean, this is what is really behind the approach that we take, in which if there are no synergies, it's very unlikely that we are going to be concerned. Now, synergies may be present, and the firm, on a case-by-case through, as we said, verifiable means based on facts, may bring them up, and we have a duty to consider them. But again, we have a number of effects that go in different directions, and I think it's very useful also to sort of take on board the insights from the academia. And in this regard, again, I'm very much supportive of the approach of the Commission to commission a study that looks at this literature in great detail. For us, for example, when we designed the guidelines on calling power, it was very relevant to think about when the acquisition of a small firm, a startup, may be pro-competitive, when instead might be damaging competition, and when it can incentivize innovation, and when instead it can be a harm to innovation. And the economic theory has said very clearly there are two contrasting effects. One is the innovation for buyout. A small entrepreneur who may not have easy access to finance may actually want to be bought by a larger firm, as this might sort of give it the possibility to sort of cash in and maybe move to another project. This innovation for buyout is a positive effect of this kind of acquisition of innovative startups. But on the other hand, there is this other effect on entrenchment that says the greater the history of acquisition within a firm of small startup or innovative firms, the lower will be the outside option of the next target, which therefore can expect less and less from investing into its project in terms of returns. This entrenchment effect not only therefore damages competition, but also reduce innovation. So to sum up, I think the very final thing, but here I'm going to be repetitive, is that we really have to consider that there is a lot that we can already do, that there is no ground for weakening merger policy to accommodate innovation. In fact, it's more likely than not that we will have a theory of harm when it comes to acquisition, especially of nascent competitors. However, if there is guidance beyond what we have already identified that may help us disentangling the various effects, that can only be welcome. But it has to be grounded on facts and on evidence and on the economic theory. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And yeah, I think it's interesting, the year of the Agion Nobel Prize, there's a lot of discussion around inverted U and the question of, is that inverted U actually a useful model to think about the effects of mergers rather than the effect of competition specifically? And I guess if we sort of take that approach of saying the literature pushes one towards a sort of presumption of innovation effects absent efficiency, so then makes it all the more important to have a framework to say how can we actually decide whether those offsetting efficiencies are there and to measure and offset them. So a lot of food for thought there. I'd like to bring you in, Ted. So you obviously coming at this from a recent experience of having your own guidelines refresh in the US. I think innovation theories were a big part of the desire to kind of update those guidelines. So could you maybe sort of talk us through how you're approaching things and any sort of tips or recommendations for the Commission as they embark on their own process?
Sure. First, just thank you very much, Ali and CRA for having me, and to give my disclaimer that the views I'm going to say are my own and not those of the Federal Trade Commission or any of its commissioners. So as we've heard in lots of ways today, innovation is really a critical part of the discussion on competition. And I just want to broaden that a little bit in a way similar to what Elisabetta did, and to say that innovation can take lots of forms. It can be a small improvement in product quality. It can be a major new innovation. All of these are different forms of innovation that we really have to think about when we're evaluating merger policy. And I think with that in mind, it's very notable how the new merger guidelines in the US navigate this issue, which really builds on some of the discussion we've been having earlier, which is to say our analysis of mergers involving innovation, the broad framework is pretty much the same as the way we analyze any other merger. So let me just say what I mean by that, and then we can flesh that out in the context of innovation. So when we typically evaluate mergers, what we're looking at is two main questions. First of all, how do the merging firm's incentive and the incentives of other firms in the market change as a result of this merger? And second of all, how do firms' capabilities, what are firms uniquely able to do after this merger that they were not able to do before? So let's take those in turn. So first, thinking about innovations. So for a standard horizontal merger, this inquiry is going to come via an analysis of market definition and competitive effects in the way that many of us are quite familiar with. In addition, if we're looking at non-horizontal or vertical mergers, we have to think about other types of changes in incentives that can potentially lead to pro-competitive efficiencies as well, as you have more incentive to invest or potentially lower prices. We also look at efficiencies through the lens of how do firms' capabilities change after the merger, and to be specific, how do those capabilities change in a way that is unique to this merger and could not be accomplished otherwise? In other words, what is the merger specificity of that? And of course, that's also true when we think about efficiencies on the incentive front. But these changes in capabilities can also come in a range of ways. They can come from process improvements in the merging firms that are only enabled by the merger, the coming together of specific assets. It could come from managerial talent, a range of things. All of those are things that we look at in efficiencies context when evaluating those mergers. So how does this apply in innovation markets? And the answer is very, very similarly. First, we look at how firms' incentives are going to change as a result of the merger. In a horizontal merger context, before the merger, a firm had incentive to innovate. One of the pieces of that incentive came from their ability to, their incentive to steal share and steal sales from their rival. After the merger, that incentive no longer exists because that rival is part of the firm. That is internalized. That is a fundamental change in incentives that happens as a result of mergers, including in innovation markets. Now, this shift, there can be other changes that happen in incentives. Elisabetta laid out some of them, but I think for most of the mergers that we are looking at the FTC anyway, that change in incentives that I just described, for most of the horizontal mergers, that is the incentive that is going to dominate. Now, there can also be changes in firm capabilities that happen as a result of a merger. But the framework we're going to use to analyze those is very similar to the framework that we use in analyzing this in the context of any other merger. We're going to ask, what is the merger specificity? Are the innovation promises, the investments they are saying they're going to happen, the new products they are going to develop, are those merger specific? Can these be done in a different way? Are they coming in with evidence that shows that these are the case? And are the merging parties, what kind of advocacy are we receiving from the merging parties on all of these things? I will also say the other place this analogy to a more standard merger comes up is in the ways in which we think about this from a policy perspective when we are evaluating these. In a situation where the change in incentives is such that we think there is going to be a large anti-competitive effect, we also think it will take a large amount of changes in firm capabilities or change in incentives to generate those efficiencies. So if there is a large anti-competitive effect, we are talking about a merger to monopoly, the changes in incentives and capabilities that would need to generate those efficiencies also would need to be quite large. And that is equally true in innovation markets as in any other market. I'll say, using our new guidelines, the FTC has applied versions of this in some recent cases. One that we're recently waiting for a decision from the court on, dealing with innovation in heart valves with the Edwards-Jenner valve case, and another from a few years ago in a vertical context, also dealing with issues in innovation of Illumina Grail. So what I'll say is the main takeaway from our recent experience with the guidelines is they give more clarity on this point that innovation, the way we think about innovation, is an extremely important part of competition, and also our broad framework for analyzing it is very similar to the way we analyze a widget merger. Thank you.
Cool, so thanks for that. So now I think, Fernando, I'd like to come to you. So I guess it's all well and good as kind of talking about new frameworks, new theories of harm, but ultimately the cases brought under these new guidelines would need to be won in court. So how do you see these dynamic theories being applied from a legal perspective? How does competition law adapt to some of the shifts we've had since the last round of guidelines?
Thank you for the invitation. And I also have to apply the same disclaimer. Of course, everything I say here is my personal view. But I will quickly go to reply or to try to reply to your question, because dynamic effects may go more into the future. This is, of course, a challenge. The future is always uncertain, and of course, the long-term future is even more uncertain. We will have to try to have a better prediction by different means. On the one hand, as it's been explained, at a more conceptual level, we need to better understand why innovation happens, when it doesn't happen, and there is a lot of literature out there, and the Commission is trying to acquire as much knowledge as possible about this literature and trying to basically have the best conceptual framework to try to identify then later on during the investigation the element that will have to be provided by by the companies or by the Commission, of course. I think we also learn from experience. It's also quite important to see a little bit in the past decisions. I believe quite a lot about ex-post evaluation, what went wrong maybe in a case we authorized, and actually it turned out to be problematic. It's not that there is an error, it's very simply that you learn by experience and then you see what we missed, if we missed something maybe that we should have done. So I think the first step, in order to try to have a more confident, predictive assessment, which has a longer time frame, is to first have a very deep analysis of the conceptual framework of innovation, what other things we should be looking at. And of course, you will have to have a look at the market, a specific market. You will have to gather as much case-specific evidence as possible, internal documents, things, because of course it's not just academic analysis will help you, give you the tools to identify the element that you will have to then focus on when you examine the case. So case-specific evidence, internal documents, different companies, how the companies see each other, what decisions have been taken about the future, what future decisions are likely, etc. So it's not an easy task in the sense that it means going more into the future. And in order to have some confidence, we will have to have better tools. You will have always some degree of uncertainty, that's very clear, but try to reduce the uncertainty in our predictive assessment. Indeed, talking about course recently have given a bit of very high-level guidance about what is the time frame. In CK Telecoms, the court says foreseeable time frame, whatever that means. In EVH, the court has talked about a reasonably foreseeable forecast, a sufficient degree of certainty, etc., etc. So, indeed, the risk is that if we go too much into the longer term, if we don't have not the perfect evidence, but something that is sufficiently good, we may have problems in court. And in some cases, this may be crucial. We have to take into account that we may have to do a weighing of, on the one hand, maybe we see in the short term a problem, less innovation, but maybe we are told, but in the longer term, you're going to have more innovation. How do you weigh that? Because, of course, the longer term is going to be more uncertain. So unless you have evidence that would point out to have the same degree of certainty as in the short term, then this is the type of thing that may become a problem later on also in court. As I said, the Commission's objective is to try to have a framework of assessment that try to give a more robust predictive assessment in the future. I think very much will also depend on who bears the burden of proof on some points, of course. If you conceptualize something as an efficiency, you could say, well, the company have to convince me to a certain level, etc., etc. Those are issues that will have to be, I think, debated later on. Yes, and I think this also, this is a bit my last point, of course, whenever you go more into the future with dynamic assessments, the counterfactuals will become more complex as well. It is inevitable, you will have to take into account more variables, not just the innovation coming from, of course, emerging companies and the loss of innovation there, but what may come up in the market by other actors. Knowing about that may imply also a big investigative effort, by the way, which is obviously the Commission has to do it when we go into phase 2, but there are limits to what you can do also in 5-6 months. Thank you.
Thank you. So I wanted to switch gears a bit away from innovation dynamics and come to you, Damien, and talk about kind of efficiencies and scale-ups and resilience, which have all been topics that we've touched on earlier in the day. There's obviously a lot of angst about European firms being subscale relative to US and Chinese ones. Is that something merger control is a tool that can contribute to fixing? Is that an issue with the single market, some of the other policy tools we discussed earlier? And if it is something that merger control can assist with, how would that look?
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to contribute also in a personal capacity to this exchange. Now, my main question is, what can I add to everything that's already been said, knowing that you're all starving? And now, look, I'd like to start with two comments, two remarks. First, it's to underline how important the ongoing exercise of updating and upgrading the merger guidelines is. I mean, it's such an important piece of guidance. It's referred to, in the daily practice of, of the European Commission, obviously, but all national competition authorities as well. I mean, it structures the thinking process of enforcers. It guides, self-assessment by firms. It enables a convergent and predictable application of what is essentially the most effective piece of, or the most effective instrument of competition intervention. And so now it's, of course, it's 20 years old, but we need to really take stock of these 20 years. I mean, these are 20 years of experience, 20 years of practice. Obviously, we also need to reflect thoroughly on the critical evolutions in market dynamics over that period. But what I want to convey here is that, it's that I'm a little bit worried that we might not be able to complete that process in the right way by rushing it out, all right? And so, I have a lot of sympathy for colleagues at DG Comp who are supposed to, complete a first draft by the end of spring. I mean, the great thing is that we all know what we're going to do next summer, right? But let's not rush things, too much. This is really too important. Second point, is that I'm also a bit concerned that the policy, this very important policy-making process is being somewhat disrupted by voices from a particular industry that is mainly active in concentrated, domestic markets or national markets, and which is spreading, arguments that are really getting tractions with politicians. And sometimes these arguments are really curious, frankly. And you've probably seen a few months ago, I mean, the competition authorities of the mid-sized EU economies, came up with a statement, to really affirm, that concern and also what they think, should happen in that industry. And frankly, I mean, other sectors are actually greater contributors to innovation and growth in Europe. And they should have their say too, I mean, and they deserve, thorough consideration. And frankly, at the end, I think it's really, it's about all of us taking responsibilities, from our respective vantage points to make, this review process a success. I think it's really too important. So these were really two short points. Now, of course, this whole review process is particularly challenging because of the context in which it's taking place. This overall concern about the current and future competitiveness of the EU economy in this, digitalized era. Now, this is not something new. The whole European market integration process, was built, based on the recognition that we had a very serious competitiveness issue at the end of World War II, right? And obviously, the introduction of the merger regulation and the current version of the merger regulation make very clear, in one of the first recital, that, this instrument is all about balancing concentration and competition with a view to increasing the competitiveness of European industry, improving the conditions of growth, and raising standard of living in the community. Now, what is new is this somewhat painful reckoning with the growing productivity gap between, the EU economy and that of the US and China. By the way, the gap is much narrower, if not inexistent, with economies like the UK, Australia, Canada, just in passing. But, and that shock was encapsulated, obviously, in the Draghi report, and we need to talk about Draghi. And also, specifically because Draghi had this very candid statement, there is a question, he said, about whether vigorous competition policy conflicts with European companies' need for sufficient scale to compete with Chinese and American superstar companies. So let's talk about Draghi. Now, to be clear, that might not actually be the main problem we're experiencing today in Europe. I think many have said it. I actually believe that we have a serious problem of governance, right? And that our main issue is our ability to mobilize resources to enable executive action. So I think there is thinking to be made around the notion of executive integration. Now, I don't want to just restate everything Draghi said, but Draghi was very specific in targeting the merger guidelines, all right? He drew on Jean Tirole and essentially said the problem is not the law as such, and the problem is that the regulatory apparatus must be made more agile and in tune with evolving economic thinking in the digital age. And he said, really what is needed is a change in operating practices and updated guidelines to make the current merger regulation fit for purpose. And there's really two main objectives. He said, essentially, these guidelines should explain how the authority assesses the impact of competition on the incentive to innovate, and that's what Elisabetta and Ted have discussed. And the second point is that updated guidelines should explain what evidence merging parties can present to prove that their merger increases the ability and incentive to innovate, allowing for an innovation defense. And if you allow, I'd just like to focus on that for a few minutes. Now, how do you translate then that Draghi's agenda into the revised merger guideline? No, I'm surprised it has not been yet mentioned that the Commission has commissioned an economic study on the dynamic effects of mergers, which will obviously inform the review of the merger guidelines. And that study is supposed to provide the analytical foundations to assess whether a merger has a positive or negative impact on these dynamic factors, how they trade off against static factors such as changes in prices or output. And my understanding is that that study is supposed to be a central piece of intelligence to inform the new guidelines. And that obviously plays also with the timing. And hopefully it can be delivered in the right time, no pressure. Now, I don't want to summarize the outcome of the consultation. Daniele did it, but clearly in the consultation you had a nice alignment between the core messages of Draghi and the core message of a number of the respondents to the consultation. Just to pick on one, what are the most important benefits associated with scale that are relevant for competitiveness? Well, first, the ability and incentives to innovate, and second, the ability and incentive to invest, right? Now, a majority of the respondents to the consultation process were of the view that the current guidelines do not provide a clear, correct, and comprehensive framework on how the Commission assesses merger efficiencies. And so let's really focus on that. How do we go about designing a more ambitious efficiency defense accounting for investments in supporting innovation strategies? Do we need a new analytical framework? And frankly, there, I don't think so. And when I heard Guillaume and Joël, I think they were convergent in considering that consumer benefit, merger specificity, verifiability, these are the core pillar of what they should remain the core pillar of the analytical framework to assess efficiencies in the future. And I largely agree with that. It's not purely a point, an argument or a point of advocacy. If you really read through the current version of the efficiency section of the guidelines, the language is very flexible on each of these points. It starts with the acknowledgement that corporate reorganization in the form of merger may be in line with the requirements of dynamic competition and are capable of increasing the competitiveness of industry, improving the conditions of growth, raising the standard of living in the community, echoing directly the recital of the regulation. And then on the three pillars, I don't want to read through those for the sake of time, but there is in fact already a lot of flexibility built into the language. So I think the framework is actually sound, but what about then the practice of assessing efficiencies? How do we improve the agility of competition authorities in assessing efficiencies, and what does that mean? And here, in fact, only Daniele knows, right? So. But I'll still give, a few considerations based on our experience at Belgian level and building on that. Now, and I'll be very short. Now, first, I think it's true that the wording of the merger guidelines in some respect displays some sort of undue caution at the beginning. I mean, it says, it is possible that efficiencies brought about by a merger may counteract, the effects on competition, etc., etc. And I think this is probably not, absolutely necessary because, in fact, efficiencies are central in the analytical framework of assessing the likely impact of concentrations on competition in the relevant market. The fact is simply that most concentrations, they do not require an in-depth assessment of efficiencies because these efficiencies are assumed to flow from the reallocation of assets in competitive market environment. And so I think it's a truism, but I think it's a basic truth as well that is fully consistent with the Draghi report, which underlines that competition, understood as the absence of market power, remains the best driver of efficiency-enhancing economic restructuring. But of course, the difficult question is, what about economic restructuring, creating or strengthening market power as a condition to unleash efficiencies? And then how to frame the operation of the trade-off between static effects and dynamic efficiencies. Now, these are very personal views, all right, in a spirit of really dialogue. I actually think that if we want to tweak a bit the approach, one way of doing it would be very open at the outset. I mean, have a posture of openness. At the beginning, I think one must be willing to consider all type of efficiencies that might arise from a concentration, especially dynamic efficiencies likely to arise from the concentration. Why? Because I think that one of the challenges as a competition authority is really to capture in full the realities of the condition of innovation in a particular industry. And I think we also have to acknowledge that dynamic efficiencies, they result inherently from a combination of a range of diverse factors, and that is very difficult to determine up front which are more or less likely to benefit customers or consumers. But then, of course, once you have actually put everything on the table, you need to start applying filters. And that's, of course, what's difficult about the whole process. A filter of merger specificity, a filter of magnitude, you have to ascribe probability factors to the realization of the efficiencies. But maybe up front, the guidelines could be more explicit about the range of dynamic efficiencies, direct and indirect, which are capable of falling within the scope of the assessment. And we've already heard from Daniele and others that there will be an attempt to come up with a taxonomy of evidence also that are relevant for that assessment. I think the guidelines could also clarify that the process of considering efficiencies should start from the very beginning of the assessment. I think that's also a point that's already been made. You shouldn't leave it to the end of phase 2, after having firmly established that there will be a significant harm to competition. But obviously that requires that parties disclose efficiency assessments and submit supporting materials, up front. And then I think if we want really to take efficiency seriously, we need to build into our authorities specific expertise. We need to have, and I know that this is the case at the DG Comp under the leadership of Emanuele, but we need to have internal financial analysts, right, capable of challenging business plans and really to understand what they mean. But also I think we need to be able to draw on external industry experts, especially when it comes to the assessment of dynamic efficiencies. And of course that takes time. There are precedents, but this is something that can be really useful. Now, if I still have 2 minutes, I would just say that openness, that doesn't mean being lenient. That doesn't mean indulging to frivolous claims. That doesn't mean succumbing to political pressure. I think it's exactly the contrary. It's about being serious about efficiencies. Notably serious in recognizing that efficiencies, and notably dynamic efficiencies, they can have diffuse effects, including beyond the markets that are considered relevant for the purpose of the merger control assessment, and notably, of course, those markets where the harm to competition is likely to occur. So, the merger guidelines could display an openness towards considering efficiencies accruing to, the same users across different product markets. And that would allow for a more holistic view, probably, of the range of addressees and beneficiaries of the efficiencies. But let's be very clear. I mean, I think trade-offs across geographies between the local and the global, I think they simply do not fit in the analytical framework. And engaging on that road, I think, frankly, also from the point of view of a national competition authority, would significantly undermine the legitimacy of the whole merger control system. Likewise, being serious means, just 1 minute. Because, I spent a lot of time last night doing this.
Our main KPI in terms of being, is the sort of pace discussion in the prior panel. Our main KPI is that we all go out for lunch at 1:30. But
all right. Look, I wanted just to say then, we need to be serious about merger specificity as well. That's very important. And I think there are many examples, including in Belgium, about ways we can achieve, scale and investment in critical infrastructure without resorting to full concentration. And I'm referring here to the cooperation in rolling out fiber networks throughout Belgium. I think, and that has been also alluded to by Guillaume, I think we can also, in certain specific circumstances, foresee a clearly identifiable positive impact on consumers of concentration, even absent the necessary data required for a precise quantitative analysis of efficiencies. And that's what is already provided for in the current guidelines. But I think in again, specific circumstances, when the harm is limited, when there will be a certain level of competition remaining, and when there is an alignment between the rationale, the efficiency claims, the deep trends in an industry, empirical evidence from the literature. I mean, I think we can be, and I think we are, bold enough to consider that a merger on balance can be allowed. That doesn't mean changing the burden of proof. I mean, obviously the burden of proof should remain with the parties, but that's something we should be able to do. And finally, absolutely finally, no, but this is important because I really think that being serious about assessing efficiencies also means that at the end of the assessment, you need to trust that the efficiencies will actually materialize, and you have to entrust the parties with that responsibility. And so I think it's really important that once you have done your assessment, and then the efficiencies, they need to stand on their own. And that's why I think it's really preferable to be very open at the beginning than trying to fix lasting concerns about magnitude and materialization. I think it's really not the role of competition authorities to engineer efficiencies. And frankly, efficiency remedies, I think frankly it's an oxymoron. It's filled with uncertainties about the long-term structural impact of the concentration in question on competition, and then by extension on productivity and competitiveness. So now you're really starving to death, and so I'm going to leave it here, but happy to hear your thoughts and keep contributing to this ongoing debate.
Thanks, Damien. A tour de force and lots of food for thought whilst people wait the remaining 10 minutes for their actual food, but really interesting stuff. I think, Fernando, I wanted to just, as a sort of last contribution before we have a bit of a wrap-up across the panel, just to get your thoughts on how you see the implementation working. We've spoken about some of the kind of big picture themes to kind of weave into the guidelines, but there's also the more sort of prosaic question of if there's elements of the case law which kind of need to be crystallized and kind of brought into the guidelines. And also maybe how much you see the guidelines as being a sort of summary of case law versus a kind of forward-looking policy document and the trade-offs there.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, about this transition, we have to bear in mind guidelines are soft law. They are not hard law. The hard law is not being changed. The legal test will remain the same. This is not a situation where what was unlawful before is now lawful or the reverse. But merger control is to a large extent a discovery process. This guideline was adopted 20 years ago. In the meantime, they indicate themselves that decision-making can evolve, because of course we know more about the economics of certain markets. We know more about the things we need to have a look at when we examine and make predictive assessments about the future. So logically there, decision-making has evolved in ways which were not explicitly sometimes foreseen in the guidelines. We have at the moment some litigation about that. In the booking case, you may know about that. We had the hearing last July, and we expect to have the judgment soon, hopefully before we adopt the guidelines, of course. we don't know if that will happen. So that's one thing. Because it's a sort of acquisition of knowledge, and it's just the guidelines try to articulate what is already in the law, but in a very vague way. I don't expect, of course, guidelines to always be disruptive in nature, in the sense I'm sure some of the aspects in the guideline, I cannot anticipate the precise content, as you can imagine, will build upon what was already in the existing guidelines. Of course, these principles have been applied many times, and therefore they can be refined, further developed in the light of this practice. But the other aspects that were not present there, precisely, for example, in the booking case, we pointed out that the notion of ecosystem is not in the guidelines of 2008, for example. Network effects are mentioned in passing almost, whereas now they are very present in some markets. So there are things which have developed outside the guidelines, not necessarily in contradiction with the guidelines, but as a development, innovation. We have a number of cases over the last 10 years, applying methods that were not explicitly foreseen. So the new guideline will build upon the existing ones on many points. In other points, there may be new things, but they will be not new in the sense of unprecedented, but they will building upon a decision-making process and experience in past cases. And there may be other aspects that are a bit more novel, but not in the sense of actually meaning a total rupture with the past. As I said, the legal test remains the same. So I think they're not so much a summary of the case. The case has covered some points, certainly on issues of evidence and the legal test. We have more clarity after CRA Telecom on some aspects of horizontal mergers, for example, about unilateral effects. But they will go beyond that, because we'll have to explore things about which there is not yet case law, but there is already a bit of decision-making practice, some experience, and we'll have to also learn, as I said, from the body of knowledge out there about some of these phenomena. Sorry, I have to be very short.
Thank you very much. Well done for rattling through it. So I wanted to wrap up. We just got a couple of minutes, and I think given it's December, I thought I'd ask maybe Daniele to play the role of Santa Claus for us, and for the rest of the panel to give us their Christmas wish for what they would like to see from the guidelines when they're published in the spring. So I'm not sure if we've got a volunteer to go first. Elisabetta? Yeah.
So thank you. I think in short, I feel confident, and I'm very happy to have had the opportunity to listen to Guillaume Loriot both today and last week about the fact that yes to engagement, no to speculation. We need to be based on facts, concrete facts, and the fact that merger guidelines are already very flexible. As I mentioned, non-price parameters can already be taken into account. We see them in market definition when we understand competitive pressure and so on. And I think really coming from the academia, the academic research can really help because even on things like resilience, as has been said, it can go really either way, and there is nothing that stands us in the way of considering it, given that competitive pressure is something that, of course, has to take into account also how reliable the competitive pressure comes, meaning from competitors come matters. So I'm very optimistic about the approach.
I'm not sure, Ted, maybe, do you want to?
Sure. So building on what I said before, and what Elisabetta said, really continuing to have good economic grounding in the guidelines, and I would add, hopefully continuing to foster international convergence toward good economic guidance in the guidelines.
Well, this Christmas is way too early, to wish anything. So by next Christmas, what I wish to see is also that on a number of pretty mainstream topics, that we really capitalize on the experience of the past 20 years. I mean, coordinated effects, I could name quite a few, and also, a nice section on counterfactual. I think that would certainly be of great added value.
Very good. Fernando?
Yeah, maybe things I'd like to see in the guideline, maybe a bit more about evidence, the type of evidence which is relevant in each type of situation. We were talking about innovation before, the type of things that maybe the Commission and the parties can bring. And of course, a bit about this issue. I see in the US merger guideline, for example, there is more language about evidence than in our guidelines of the 2000s, and I would hope maybe to have a bit more of that.
Okay, so with that,
I have a lot, so probably we'll do it over lunch. But I mean, to wrap up, I think maybe a little bit. One, I mean, in the part of Italy where I come from, it's a woman, it's not Santa Claus that brings presents, and you have to be good. So what I'm asking, knowing that it's our hosts are economists, I know there's a lot of the demands for keeping it simple, to do it in a way that keeps it simple, etc. I mean, I think be mindful, because a lot of the people that say, I mean, your system is way too complex, it goes in the wrong direction, has in mind the fact, I mean, people actually say that in the public consultation, you should not hire economists to show your case. So that's, what some people want. So I think that the demands of keeping it fact-based, I think it's in everybody's interest, not just because of the employment concern here, but also because it's facts-based, and that's what we have to strive for. And thank Damien for reminding me that I didn't mention the study, but I think that the Executive Vice President mentioned that we are reviewing a lot of economic contributions to get the framework right on dynamic effects on innovation. And where I want to leave it really is, she said this morning something very interesting in response to a question from Rafael. It's like, what makes some people happy makes other people unhappy. So ultimately, Fernando reminded us we're not reviewing the legislation, we are reviewing guidelines, which are essentially an act that is out there for everybody to see. Here's the lawyer coming out, that basically constrains the discretion that we have as an authority, because that's how we explain to business, this is how we'll do it. And we explain it to the businesses that will be on the winning side of some and on the losing side of others. That is why it is so important to get it right and to do it based on facts and not just on wish lists. That's my wish.
Very good. I think we can all agree with that. It just leaves me to thank an excellent panel for a great discussion.